right, hello everyone. Today we're looking at women and art in the early Renaissance, specifically looking at patrons and then women artists. This is where we get to the period where we actually start to know specific women and by name and the specific work that they're doing. This is in the very early period. And it's just going to increase in numbers by as we continue through the Renaissance and surrounding periods. So if we look at, here's the topics. Again, as always, you can look at those on your own. So want to give a little bit of background and structure before we get started to understand kind of the context, because we were coming from a period in the Middle Ages where we're talking about urban women and working in the various arts and the guilds and having these opportunities. And then this gets retracted essentially as we shift to Florence in the 15th century. There were not a lot of professional artists in this period, in part because Florence was the location to be for art. It was at the height of the early Renaissance and the art scene. With not only the guilds, but the powerful families like the Medici family and others that were massive patrons of these arts, that just led to this massive flourish of art, and but was super restrictive for women opportunities due to both social and institutional restrictions. It was one of the most industrialized cities in Europe, and yet that urban labor that we talked about before, again, was not there because the guilds were super restrictive in Florence and barred women from membership. And of course, part of the roles of artists and how one became a professional, and to be specific, a professional artist, right? There always were women that were creating art and making art. But to be considered a professional artist, you had to be part of a guild, an official guild during this time. And the only people that were allowed to be in guilds were men. And the way that it worked was you when you were younger, you would work as an apprentice and train largely in like fresco techniques and oil painting. And then you under a master who was part of the guild, and then eventually, it would take quite a long time, but eventually you would become a master and part of the guild yourself. So here's a good example of a workshop where the men are working on different art. The reason that women were restricted and excluded from this system was the fact that the study of the naked male body was an essential part of the training that was studied, and that was seen as not proper for women to be, I guess, exposed to that. And therefore they were not allowed to participate in that. And if you couldn't participate in the study of the male physical form, and this becomes a key characteristic through many years after this, that used as a reason to exclude women from being official professional artists or being part of schools for artists, when it shifts to more like school-based systems than the guilds, is that, well, the study of the male body, women, this is not, appropriate for women to be participating in, therefore they cannot be part of this school or this guild because that's not allowed. And therefore all of this and not being part of the guild restricts women to, we'll say, at-home artists, because they could not be considered professional artists if they were not part of the guild, and then they wouldn't be allowed to be part of the guild because of studying the male form. The other part, of course, was the social expectation of women, the role of women for a period of time. Now, we're going to look at how this changes and transitions a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit. But there was very kind of restrictive expectations of what would be the ideal man and woman. In fact, these paintings here of the Duke and Duchess of Urbino are probably actually a good example of the ideal woman and the ideal man. And there were very kind of narrowly defined roles about women as a wife and mother, and the kind of strict societal norms that were expected of them in this process during this. Right, and the noblewoman was supposed to essentially be chaste, dependent on her husband, there for aesthetics over function, and then of course to be a mother. And so you have here this portrait of this woman who is finely in her elaborate headdress and clothing, very obviously wealthy. So what was common in the Renaissance with portrait pictures is that they would show dogs because wealthy families could afford these smaller pet dogs. And they almost always were small dogs because working dogs had a purpose, but the smaller pet dogs that were the lap dogs were seen as more frivolous and more expensive to maintain just for the purpose of a pet at the time. So a lot of portraits, especially for women, would show them with a dog to highlight their wealth and influence. Of course, dogs also represented loyalty and chastity, so that also had that reference into it as well. But she's, looks reserved, looks regal in her sitting in the chair, in this kind of ideal state as a wife of a wealthy noblewoman, whereas the husband is in his military armor, standing, looking strong and proud, and as a soldier. And this kind of embodied that is gender expectations and norms at the time. The other thing is that marriages were arranged for political and economic gain during this time a lot. I mean, this is always the case. This wasn't something new, but this was so much a part of Florence politics, and then in all parts of Italy and during the period of the Pope, and there's some crazy political structures going around, but there was the essential for family alliances to choose who your daughter was going to marry, was specifically, so the idea was that marriage of the daughter was not about love at all. It was all about political and social gain, right? What could benefit the family? And so family members, if the father was around, the father and mother, if it was someone else raising the kids because the parents had died, then those family members would select, without any input from the daughter, who she was going to marry, based on what would provide the best social and political gain for the family as a whole, not for their daughter, but also for the family. So it wasn't just like, hey, this is a good marriage for our daughter because this will elevate her. Is to know that this will create a family alliance that will elevate all of us, and it would be mutually beneficial to the families, in that sense. So because of this, it made the idea of virginity and chastity essential to the transaction of marriage. In 1415, Florence forbade married women from drawing up a will or disposing of dowry if it might be seen as detrimental to her husband or children, and women were not allowed in public offices or in any kind of legal manner whatsoever. So typically, dowries had been a thing that had been the one thing that women had control over in the past. But what had changed during this time was that there was, I suppose, this kind of lip service to, sure, women get to pick how they dispose of their dowry, as long as it's seen as beneficial to the husband and the children. So she didn't really have full and total control, where in some of the other societies, women truly did have full control over their dowry. They didn't have control over anything else, but they had control over their dowry. And just as a reminder, dowries were the wealth that was transferred from the bride, from her family to her, that went with her into the marriage. And it was supposed to be a form of protection, that if you had a deadbeat husband, if he died young, if he divorced and ditched you, the dowry was the wife's to keep. Like, the husband couldn't diminish in a lot of societies. Now, this isn't everywhere, but in a lot of societies, the husband couldn't diminish the value of the dowry. And the dowry was usually not just like money, but like any kind of movable property. So that could be clothing, that could be furniture, that could be jewelry, it could be, and then it could also be money and other types of things like that. And the idea is that that value of whatever the dowry was meant to be enough to establish your daughter, if again she had to support herself, she could utilize that dowry to do so. And then, because that was supposed to be that protection, that was the one thing where women tended to have access to control in a will, was their dowry. They may not have any control over any other aspect of the will, even if their husband had died, but the dowry was theirs to kind of dispense. Now, it obviously usually went to their children, but it didn't. The point being, it didn't have to. But here in Florence, with in 1450, the law essentially said no, dowries have to be for the benefit of the husband and the children, limiting what they could do with their dowry in that case. So it was super restrictive in that sense, right? And they really intentionally into women into super dependent roles on men during this period. Initially, again, we're going to see some change that does take place as the time goes on with that. Education and training women focus specifically on the skills of managing households and fulfilling roles of wives and mothers, because ultimately, right, this was their only role. So women were highlighted in art, as you can see here, as we can see with the Duke and Duchess of Urbino, as the whole point was, one, to show off their wealth, because that was still a thing that was important, but also then to highlight this idea of chastity, of virginity, of submissiveness, essentially, of someone who's going to be a good wife, a good manager of the household, a good mother. And so the education emphasized that. And whereas in the early Renaissance, as it was developing, the emphasis was for men was to get an education in a variety of subjects. Early Renaissance women were only taught the skills that would make them competent housewives, along with religious instruction. So that was religious teachings was another component of that did remain. But outside of those kind of areas, that was the main aspect, right? And of course, within religious education, the idea was that this would emphasize submission to their husbands. And ultimately with this meant that women weren't really seen in public outside of church, and usually were married pretty young in the Florence region, around 16 or 17, whereas in Northern Europe, women did not marry until 25 or 26. Because and this is because ultimately women in this region did not play an economic role in society outside of marriage. Their economic benefit was the marriage itself. So there was value in earlier marriages for a variety of reasons, to ensure that they still were a virgin, to produce an economic gain for the family before they were much older, versus when you have women that can start to work as artists and professional artists and make money, or in we saw in the Middle Ages where there were other urban opportunities, then the value isn't just in the marriage. But in this earlier period in this region, it really was about that value of what they could bring to the marriage, what they could bring to the family through that. Now, this begins to change with the development and changes in the Renaissance period with humanism and the Castiglionis, the courtier. So, near the end of the 15th century, a small number of women's roles began to change with the humanist movement. And this movement was an intellectual one that looked at the study of classical Greek and Roman culture, art, and created a new interest around education, critical thinking, philosophy, history, language, poetry, and the study of Greeks and Romans as valuable creators of art and philosophy. The idea, and this leads to like the key component of the Renaissance in general, was a look to Greek and Roman culture and art, right, for education and the creation of art. And then this also led to, in art, this emphasis. You can see here, this is a sketch of the pantheon of Greek and Roman style art mixed with, we'll say, contemporary clothing and religious themes. So they did like this big mashup. Now there was Renaissance art that was actually just kind of remakes of classical sculptures and paintings and things like that didn't go beyond doing some small tweaks and style changes of the Greek sculptures and art. So there was that. But what was really common is that you would have this kind of Greek style, but that they would sometimes, and they did mix it up actually. Sometimes it was Greek style with Greek and Roman clothing, but and then with religious themes. But a lot of times what they did is it was Greek, and it was the classical style of art that they were studying and incorporating. But then all the people would be a biblical scene. So it'd be a scene about Jesus or a story from the New or Old Testament. But then the main characters in the art would be wearing contemporary clothing and styles that were popular at the current time. And so it was this interesting mashup of classical, contemporary, and religious, Christian religious themes, all mixed into the creation of artwork. So we'll see, even when we began to look at these women artists, that there are some of them have an emphasis on religious themes, and follow that same kind of style, along with portraits also being popular as well. So with this humanist ideas, though, besides shifting to the looking at the classical work, it influenced, like I said, a small group of noblewomen, first in the courts and then to regular nobility, that allowed some to emerge as scholars and authors that were educated and trained by family members. So that's a big step, because you now start to have that, the value of studying classical culture and art should apply to both men and women as part of this view. The humanists generally believe that women should receive the same training as men in Latin, philosophy, and mathematics, and also history, geometry, arithmetic, classical literature. And so what this eventually led to is actually creating schools for upper class girls in the court and in the towns to be taught, which then led to a big, huge shift of women actually writing defenses in support of women's education and intellect in that process. And that was a big deal. And then this coincided with Castione, who wrote the Book of the Courtier. This is Castione here. The he wrote the Book of the Courtier was like all the ways of like what a male courtier should, the skills and knowledge that he should have. And then what got added to it was what the lady should have, the lady of the court should have, and the ideals of essentially upper class women. And this had significant impact on women, because it promoted of course promoted like the typical virtues and being womanly for women, but also he specifically talked about this idea that women also should have certain education that was similar to the male courtier. And this specifically looking at like music, dance, and writing, and the history of art. And he specifically said all practices of art. So that's painting, that type of stuff, music, dance, writing, drawing, painting. Those all were seen, he said, were positive attributes of a court lady. And this immediately opened up to the nobility educating their daughters in the arts and music and dance, which had otherwise been seen as unacceptable, to downright scandalous, depending on what it was. And this established arts not only as a professional skill, but an example of a refined education worthy of a noblewoman. So that's important, because this is then when we start getting women, younger girls being educated in the arts, and the spinet, this upright piano, and other musical instruments, and dance, when before that had not been appropriate. And it was very regulated just to being a wife and mother. So this leads to significant change with that. I just wanted to show just a couple quotes from the readings that we looked at. So you have from the Courtier, right? And he mentions another person talking about arguing that women should be educated the same. It says the discussion turns to defining the court lady. And then Medici addresses the company of ladies and gentlemen. Although my Lord Gasper has said that the same rules which are set the courtier also serve the lady, he says, then he goes on and says, I'm of another mind. Well, there are some qualities to both and necessary to men as to women. There are others that are not befitting. And he talks, of course, about bodily exercises, words, manners, gestures, right? Those are unladylike. But then says, now, if this precept be added to the rules of these gentlemen have taught for the courtier, I certainly think she ought to be able to profit by many of them, and to adorn herself with admirable accomplishments, as my Lord Gasper says. For I believe that many faculties of mind are as necessary to women as to man. So that's a big deal to have that being, especially how the Book of the Courtier became like the guidebook of the Renaissance man and then woman. And the court and the noblemen and women followed this, as it kind of gave it acceptance that this was the appropriate way to educate yourself as a courtier, as a lady, and thus parents started educating their daughters accordingly. And he says at the very end, and to repeat in a few words part of what has already been said, I wish this lady to have knowledge of letters, music, painting, and to know how to dance and make merry, accompanying the other precepts that have been taught to the courtier with discreet modesty, and with the giving of a good impression of herself. And thus in her talk, her laughter, her play, her jesting, in short, in everything, she will be very graceful and will entertain appropriately. Now, key with this is that, right, these things are important for a woman, a court lady, to know, because that way she can properly entertain and engage with the court. So the courtier and stuff, or the prince, it still was seen as like that women were doing this for men, but that if they wanted women to properly interact and engage with men, they needed to have these skills. And so while it still, of course, was not like, hey, I just think women are equal and just as intelligent, it's more like, no, we need the women to be properly intellectually stimulating and engaging for as ladies of the court for the courtiers. Therefore, they need to do this, right? But not whichever the reason, it still opened up additional education for women that wasn't there before, and that is this is a big reason then that the women we're going to look at were actually able to become professional artists as much as they were because of this shift. If they had been earlier, that would have been incredibly difficult, if they even would have had the education in art and music and other things to be able to then be known artists, because it would have been so restrictive in the past. This also directly led, we're going to scroll down past these other ones, to Christine de Pizan from the Book of the City of the Ladies. And she wasn't the only one. She's probably the best known, though, where then women actually started writing in defense of women learning and being intelligent and equal to men. So again, I picked out just a few highlights from this on that, and so this is they're like she's writing like she's having a conversation, and it says, could you talk a little bit more about how they believe that one normally sees that men know more than women do? And she answered, "Do you know why women know less? Not unless you tell me, my lady. Without the slightest doubt, it is because they are not involved in many different things, but stay at home, where it is enough for them to run the household, and there is nothing which so instructs a reasonable creature as the exercise and experience of many different things." So she's specifically talking about how this emphasis and focus only on being a housewife and managing the household is the only reason women know less, is because they're limited based on what their focus is. And then she says a little bit later, therefore, I'm amazed by the opinion of some men who claim that they do not want their daughters, wives, or kinswomen to be educated because their mores would be ruined as a result. So this was another argument. Well, if women are overly educated, they'll have bad morals. She responded, how can you clearly see that not all opinions of men are based on reason, and that those men are wrong? For it must be presumed that mores necessarily grow worse from knowing the moral sciences which teach the virtues. Indeed, there is not the slightest doubt that moral education amends and ennobles them. How could anyone think or believe that whoever follows good teaching or doctrine is worse for it? So she's arguing here, like, how could anyone think that that learning would make you worse for it, right? That it only is going to improve your ability to make good moral decisions, essentially. So these were definitely targeted towards, here, I'll go back to, this was definitely targeted towards the argument that, that did come up of why women shouldn't be educated. So you now had the Book of the Courtier specifically talking about the role of the court lady, and then you had women starting to write in defense of women in education, all which allowed them and encouraged them to pursue these specific areas in art, music, dance, writing, and painting as acceptable, refined ones. Of course, they still had limitations, but this was a huge step forward in that, which then ultimately led to, again, like I said, more of these early professional women artists. Now, at the same time that this was emerging, one other really popular role for really wealthy women were to be, as has been in many of the past ages, female patrons of art. And there were probably two really well-known patrons of art during this period that it collected quite a bit, were massive patrons of the arts. They played a huge role. So Isabella d'Este was a famous woman patron of this period, and she had a massive collection of art, which contained classical sculpture, antique coins, paintings from contemporary artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, and many other things. She was the daughter of, it was a very diverse art collection during this period. Both of these women looked like they were desperately trying, the more they collected, frantically collecting art in order to, save something. But in one way, this was a way for them to participate in the arts, even if they weren't artists themselves, and was seen initially a little more acceptable than female painters that were following on the heels of this. And so this allowed them to be able to express themselves and use art. They both to use art as propaganda as well, right? So both these women understood the value of being a patron of art as a form of propaganda to reinforce their rule and their political control of the region. So in that sense, it was very smart as well. She was the daughter of a duke who ruled the region and married another duke. There's over 20,000 letters that survive that provide documentation of her negotiations with artists and methods for purchasing these antiquities, and show her extreme desire to collect ancient artwork. And if she couldn't find the ancient artwork, she would then have a local sculptor. Antico was her favorite, create statuettes in golds and bronze in this antique style to replicate some of that. She had a bust of the Roman Emperor Octavian. Venus was given by Cesare Borgia, who was likely the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander. Oh yeah, back in this period in time, the popes definitely were political giants, not just religious giants, and also somewhat nefarious at times, and had children. And it definitely there is a whole crazy period with the popes and how they were politically more powerful than the kings, and openly political. One pope rode around in armor down the streets as a soldier warrior. They controlled absolutely everything, and certainly were not chaste and had children, legitimate or illegitimate. So a little bit different time than later reform movements that took place later with that. But she also had a Cupid by the ancient Greek sculptor Praxiteles. So she had this massive amount of sculptures and antiquities, and then, like I said, she commissioned copies when she couldn't find what she was looking for. She decorated the studio and the grotta with paintings, coins, cameos, books, sculptures, all which were meant to reflect her taste and interest. She was responsible for the construction of multiple buildings, essentially buildings that's what these were, to hold and house her art that she had created. She had held on to paintings, books, coins, cameos, all of that, and this was so well known that it was preserved after her death and remained intact by being preserved by her grandson, as because her collection was so well known, public, and extensive. You have the surviving portraits of Isabella and accounts of her commissions show that she was and this one here is a portrait of her. She was intentional about the artwork, not just collecting artwork, but any artwork that was made of her. This portrait, and then this one, as you have, is a sketch drawing by Da Vinci, right? And that it was all carefully curated. That this is that propaganda, right? We could say art as propaganda. They knew, they were very smart, and both her and then we're going to look at Catherine de Medici, were very smart at knowing how they could utilize art to control the narrative. And they, these were powerful women, but yet women still had a lot of limitations, even from super wealthy, powerful families, of what they could do publicly in terms of political authority. And so one of the ways to help shape and curate that was to utilize and commission portraits of them in a way that they wanted to make sure that they were portrayed. She had a bronze medal coin kind of style that was created of her from the side portrait she liked. She really liked the not direct on. Like a lot of portraits, it was like straight face on, and this one, she always liked this side. You can see it here. And this portrait here is really good one to highlight. This was meant to emphasize, like, she's got this super determined look on her face, showing that she was strong and determined, and with a super elaborate clothing and headdress to highlight her wealth. The black background is meant to brightly contrast her so that she almost looks like she's glowing, right? This was all intentional. And then you see Da Vinci's this kind of side profile, and then the medal or coin was also this side profile as well. Now she had a bunch of these medals made, and so that she could hand them out to those she favored. And then she made one that actually that like she kept, and that one like had like was larger, and it was basically put into a gold back that had essentially these gems that encircled it, and it was much more elaborate and embellished with these gems and diamonds. And that one she kept for herself. So just the normal like coin medal here was given out to people, and then she had a more elaborate one that she kept for her collection, right? And even like I said, Da Vinci's drawing was a more idealized version of her. This one made her look more soft and domestic, right? And then the other portrait was a determined kind of ruler, and to highlight her wealth and her determination. But all of this was done again in careful control and regulation through her commissions, and then also her interest in just the voracious nature of her collecting. And it was one way again that wealthy women could control the narrative and also participate in art, even if they weren't artists themselves. Catherine de' Medici is probably the also maybe better known, and her life is crazy. But she was also, everything that she commissioned was she directed. Like, she had a lot of say in how the artwork was created of her after a certain age. And she had collections of artwork too, but she also was whereas Isabel did a more of like she had obviously the commissions, but she did a ton of collecting of antiquities. She wanted all the classical and Greek and Roman antiquities that she could find in art. Catherine was more about commissioning artwork, a lot of it, and architecture and buildings, all to highlight her wealth and power. She also ends up being Queen of France, so more powerful too, and ruling as regent in her son's stead. So she also had more to be able to utilize to commission for these projects. Again, though, meant to be powerful, permanent statements, especially with the architecture of her power, of her control, to promote her family. But her, like I said, her life is really interesting. She was born into one of the most powerful families in Florence, and was the daughter of the Duke of Urbino and Madeleine de la Tour, who, unfortunately for her, both her father and mother died a month after Catherine was born. And she ends up becoming the Duchess of Urbino and the sole heiress to the Medici fortune, which the Medici family was, well, there were times where their power waned a little bit, but they were one of the most powerful families in Florence. And prior Medicis had been major patrons of art. They like Da Vinci and many of them, like best known male Renaissance artists, were commissioned and given stipends, monthly allowances to produce art and inventions and creations just for like the Medici family and acquaintances. And then they would display these, and the idea being that there was basically competitions between these ruling families to show off publicly the art that they commissioned. And the more elaborate and crazy art you commissioned and could display, the more kind of power you were highlighting. So it's kind of funny that it was like a, it wasn't the only thing. They were kind of thugs too, but this competition of artwork, who's more powerful based on the artwork they're portraying. So she moves in initially with like an aunt who then ends up dying as well. She stayed with several families when she was young, and then she ends up being taken hostage at one point when she was 8 years old, and then they do get her back, and then she spends several years in convents after that. So, not a great childhood. That it could have been if her parents hadn't died. At 14, she's married her cousin, I believe, is who marries her to Henry II, because this is a period where the Medici name had declined some, and so this marriage was very intentional, an attempt to revigorate the Medici name and power. She married Henry II, that is aligned the Medici family with the French royalty, and was meant to secure political influence. Now, Henry II was the second son. So he wasn't intended to be the king. He was not the heir to the French throne, the Dauphin as it's called. But his brother ends up dying, elevating him to the heir to the French throne, and thus Catherine as the future queen of the French throne. So he ends up becoming king, and she ends up becoming queen. So she was not married to the future king when she got married, but because of the death of the older brother, Henry II ends up becoming the French king, and thus, of course, elevating her to an even higher status, as well, of course, wealth and power that all that entailed. So after Henry II became king, he ended up dying as well. And then Catherine ends up playing an active role in her son's rule. She had 3 sons that ended up ruling. And here's one portrait that shows the 3 sons and then one of her daughters. And she often later in life, I would say this is a really early portrait of Catherine. But still wearing black, or black and white with a lighter background. But in her later artwork that she had commissioned of her, she was almost always shown in black. In part, it was this idea of mourning and using that for political reasons, and then also black is connected to power and wealth. So it was a combination of that. Being utilized to highlight that. And she had many portraits commissioned of her kids, of her, again, in order to control the narrative. She was very much aware of the power of art and what it could produce in that process, and the royal tradition and political authority, right? Because so when her sons took over, one of her sons was old enough to rule, but she advised him. And then when that son died, I mean, it is sad. She had so many kids that died, and a lot of children, even from noble families, they'd have like 10 children, and 4 would make it into adulthood. And then even in this case, those that made it into adulthood ended up dying. Still, she had 2 sons that were kings, that ruled as the king of France, that died while she was still alive. Her last son was assassinated, who was king, is assassinated after she passed. But her next son, like, she also ruled as like a regent. So if the if you're the king, if the king passes and his son, who's the heir, is next to be king, is too young to actually rule, you have a regent. And we've talked about this before. And so then women, often the mothers, were often ones that would rule as regent. And they essentially ruled in their son's name until he was old enough and trained enough to rule in his own right. Occasionally, women held onto that power longer than was needed. We saw in Egypt with Hatshepsut, she just took over and said she was pharaoh. That was more rare, but women did sometimes hold on longer than was needed because they were running the government, even though they didn't have the official title of king, and while they were queen, they weren't technically the ruling queen. It would be whoever their son was going to marry. And so it kind of had all that play to it. And so she was a major patron of the arts, and both in architecture and in paintings. Another was the tapestries. There is a series of tapestries that are just massive. These things are very large. So she commissioned a series of tapestries that were woven in Brussels with and they were meant to feature the French royalty, the courtiers, and shape the public image and prestige, specifically showing these festivals, right? And then always with the royal family, or some of the royal family, in the foreground, so that it was clear that they were the patrons of these festivals for the French people, right? And so she had them. But I mean, you can see even this tapestry is super elaborate, like the amount of work that it would take to make this, and it wasn't just, and not just the elaborate aspect of the size. So it was woven in Brussels with wool, silk, and precious metal wrapped threads, and they were 14 feet high, so that you can't tell from the picture here that the French king, and the princes and princesses were essentially life size, along with sometimes prominent courtiers that were displayed in these. And they almost always were in the foreground like this, staring at the viewer, essentially saying, "Hello, look what we have done," kind of thing. And showing by throwing these, and they actually threw these elaborate festivals, so it wasn't just in the tapestries. Like, these festivals actually took place, but by throwing them and then depicting them in the artwork, and especially these magnificent, massive pieces that they had publicly displayed, she was attempting to control the narrative and the public perception of her and her family, because again, unfortunately for her, the French were extremely critical of her. And kind of always saw her as an outsider. And so this was an attempt to show herself amongst the people, and also other powerful people, and establish a sense of prestige and commonality amongst the people. She also commissioned the hotel, couple hotels, as well and with the hotel in Paris, she had an area of the city demolished to accommodate the massive project. So again, you aren't able to do that outside of her role. She also, her most famous project was the extension of the chateau on the Cher River. This part here. And of course the pen is not working here. Let me get this for a second. But it's the bridge part of it. And it's elaborate and stuff. It's what is called with adding these parts onto the bridge is called the gallery. And they were rooms essentially. And it overlooked the Cher River. And right, it's meant, you can see with the reflection that it creates in the water, and just it's very impressive. She knew, again, how to use the visual arts, to create architecture to her own strategic ends in a way that was far more masterful and outsurpassed most queen's patronage at the time. And in part, she somewhat almost had to do this to fight for that control and authority, because again, she was constantly having to, there I get it work again. This is the part, all of this that is like creating the rooms and the whole building over the bridge, and then the bridge was still there inside that people could walk through. She had to kind of fight most of her life, even though she was born into one of the wealthiest families because of circumstances, and she utilized art to maintain control and fight for that power and control. Now, early female artists and their contributions, we're going to look at that. The first one we're going to look at is Propercia de Rossi and her work as a sculptor, and which was unusual in itself. Women were rarely sculptors at this time, mostly painters, and so that was an unusual medium for women artists in general. And it certainly highlights the barriers that women still face within the art world, right? There was essentially seen as generally acceptable mediums of art and topics, and so you don't often see women breaking from that during this period. So that while you have women can be artists and kind of professional artists, there were almost no other female sculptors at this time, and that actually lasts for quite a long time, where we are talking, many years later, where you're still having these women sculptors, that it's rare that there's this one female sculptor, because it was so much connected to male artists, that it wasn't seen as the feminine style of art that was acceptable for the most part. However, she was really good at it, and ends up, we don't know a lot about her training as a sculptor, and how she got started, but she ends up carving the relief, the Chastity of Joseph, which is this one here, and shows Joseph leaving with his wife grabbing onto him, trying to hold onto him or bring him back. She also carved these intricate miniatures on peach stones. This was part, this carving, this relief, so this is a relief carving. And so sculpture, you have relief, and then in the round is what people tend to think of with regular sculpture, but that's where you can walk all the way around it and see the whole thing. Relief, right, is carved into flat surface. It's usually on, like, it's like creates a facade of buildings, sometimes on pottery as well. So like that this would have been on like part of like it could be on an altar or a building. That tends to be what reliefs are with that. And so, right, Joseph is moving towards the left, avoiding the embrace of his wife in this particular one, but very much in that classical Greek and Roman style, both in the clothing, the body, the movement. Again, sculptures are really always impressive because it is difficult to create movement and flow and the look of fabric. That's all very hard to do. In Vasari's book, The Lives of Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, that he wrote in 1568, he says this image is a depiction of her unhappy love life. Right, so this, I didn't put that in here, this right. So we'll put Vasari's book, right? So this is 1568, and he wrote about different, again, painters, sculptors, and architects, that this was a depiction of her unhappy love life. And what's significant about that is there's no indication that that's the case at all. But it highlights, again, the struggles and interpretations of women's art when they made art, that they had to deal with these gender ideologies impacting the whole discourse on their work. specifically, interpreting it based on this idea of, oh, that they're, they're pushy, or they're unhappy with their life, or they're loose morals. And this was something that women had to consider and contend with as artists, because this was always a possibility that the artwork would be interpreted within this kind of gendered ideology structure. She died of the plague in 1530, and due to the time of her death, we don't have a lot of information about her life and art, outside of the some of the miniatures, and then this more famous relief that she made for the church. But the fact that as a woman, she was selected and was commissioned to carve this relief for the church is significant in of itself, because that was not something that anyone else up to this point, any woman, had been selected for. And again, shows her skill, shows the kind of classical style of the Renaissance that she obviously was influenced by. The next artist that is much more well known, Sofonisba Anguiscola. Anguiscola was the first female artist of the Renaissance to achieve international fame and recognition during her lifetime. And we have a lot more artwork of her. She had the ability to create the lifelike portraits that were engaging and flattering. And she also used self-portraits to promote herself and define her artwork and herself. And then used the skill to create official portraits of the Spanish royal house that highlighted their ability to rule, which kind of skyrocketed her into being well known and people actively wanting her artwork. So this is one of the earliest that she created on this kind of miniature pendant. She was often shown in self-portraits holding either painting tools, the family emblem, which is here. This is the family emblem, which is like massive, or letters and books. So those are the three things that she was shown in her self-portraits holding. And it was intentional, right? Like these early artists, the women had to consciously think about how they were portraying them, especially in self-portraits. How are you portraying yourself? What is it that you're wanting to emphasize? And education, as a painter in your own right, as intelligent and educated, right? Those things all were areas that she wanted to make sure that she portrayed. She was the eldest of 6 daughters in a noble family. And of course, following the popularized advice by Castiglione and the courtier, she was given instruction in painting and music that was then now befitting of someone of her rank, right? Which earlier years would not have been, but because of the courtier, because of this new emphasis on this education, she was educated at a very young age in art, along with her other siblings. Her other sisters. Not all ended up painting. One went into the convent as a nun. Some of the other sisters followed in her footsteps of painting, but none had quite the skill level she did. And you can see here in this portrait of her as she's a little bit older. She's, at the easel. And so it's a painting and a painting. You have the painting that she's making in the self-portrait, and then the painting of her. And this was a really clever way, too, of doing a double painting, where you have the painting that she's working on, and then the portrait of herself as well. And it's getting to highlight her skill as a painter, not just as a self-portrait, but as a painter. The painting is not a self-portrait, right? And so it's this clever use of this double painting to highlight her skill, even at she's relatively young at this age. With that. She painted more self-portraits than any other artist from the 1500s all the way to the 17th century. So it took after the 17th century for an artist to paint more self-portraits than she did. So she was a highly prolific painter, and specifically a self-portrait painter, and her self-portraits were highly sought after. Um, one person wrote, although this is slightly creepy too, but one person wrote to her father, a patron wrote to her father, "There is nothing that I desire more than the image of the artist herself, so that in a single work I can exhibit two marvels, one the work and the other the artist." So, right, which she's trying to, of course, say her looks and the marvel of her and also her artwork. Which could just be a compliment depending on if that's with anyone else and not just a creepy stalker of her, or it's slightly creepy depending on I guess if this patron also collected other people's self-portraits because they liked to see the artist, and they saw these artists as marvels and then also their artwork as a marvel, then okay. But I do wonder with that quote, like, did they just like it because she was a young, attractive woman, and that's what they mean by that? I don't know. Nonetheless, it did highlight the desire and like of having the artist, like, it basically, right? You don't have photographs. This was a way to show, look at this amazing artwork, and look, that's the artist. So in that sense, it makes sense, and the ability to be able to show off to people, this is the artist. I get a visual of what the artist looks like. I can show off that this is the artist, almost like I know them. And it's the artwork in itself is amazing. And so I get a magnificent artwork in the process of owning a self-portrait as well. She studied first with Bernardino Campi, as well as other artists in her hometown in northern Italy, and then later started studying with Gatti for about 3 years, and then eventually traveled to Rome to advance her career, which it was normal. Rome was the epicenter of like that, the art and advancement of one's career. Because she was a noblewoman, there was still, as much as the whole like education aspect was now acceptable, there was still this negative view towards professional female artists. And so she actually didn't receive payment for most of her works, but instead she still received payment. She didn't receive cash. Instead, she receives valuable gifts that were meant to express the gratitude, right, for her work. The other part was her works were unsigned. So what this ended up doing, and it mentions here, is that there were many artworks attributed to male artists, and then was only later credited to her. And in part, that of course, and this happens anytime, and there's several reasons for this. So why unsigned? In part, it could be we don't have specifics. She didn't write down like, I don't sign my work because there still was this taboo around being a professional female artist. One way to circumvent that was to not sign your work. Professional artists sign their work. And then that way it's, clearly she was a professional artist, and she was getting very expensive gifts that you could turn around and sell or keep, and you were making money off of these, but they just weren't giving her direct cash all the time for it, because it was still she was kind of in that transitioning period of, we don't pay, women are, supposed to have this skill in art, but not be professional. And so that, and not signing it, allowed for that to be acceptable. It fit then within the courtier's version of the ideal court lady and noblewoman. Of course, again, like I said, that ultimately meant that for quite a long period of time, many of her artworks, it was just simply assumed that a woman artist could not paint such, fantastic art, that had to have been male artists. And only later then recognizing the style, the painting, to be able to credit it properly to her. Again, we don't know for sure. She didn't write down why she didn't sign it, but most likely this was the reason, was because it made it easier to say, well, look, I'm not a professional artist. I didn't sign my work. I'm not getting paid for it, right? Therefore, I fall under the acceptable structure of the noblewoman and the courtier. She ends up being invited to be a lady in waiting and an art tutor to Queen Elizabeth, and joining the Spain's royal inner circle. This was huge. This is what propelled her career, because it put her in the middle of all the major wealthy patrons, right? And if you have a king and queen displaying your artwork, right, everyone, all the other courtiers are going to want your artwork as well. Her most she has several because she was so well known and kind of like internationally well known. She has several notable works that are very recognizable as hers. This is probably the most well-known one that's put in textbooks all over the place, that shows up. It's the chess game, which showcases her sisters, and it still kind of gives a peek into the kind of domestic life of a family of girls, of wealthy noble girls, but also pushes on the edge of the idea of women in education, because they're playing chess, right? They're not sitting in the garden or holding children or babies. I mean, her youngest sister's really young, but instead they're actually playing a chess, a game of intellect, right? And yet also gives us a look at the style of dress, the hair. They have the maid in the background highlighting that wealth, and also highlights her talent in landscape. So one of the things that's really crazy impressive about this artwork is that you have multiple things that it highlights in that system. One is, of course, the emotional expression and interaction, facial expressions, gestures, right? You have the youngest child almost smirking at her sister losing, her other sister holding up her hand in defeat, looking at her eldest, well, not eldest, but older sister, almost like with a little bit look of disbelief. And then the winner, the older sister, looking directly at the viewer with like kind of a smirk on her face for having won. So this or amusement of this, all while the nurse kind of checks in and looks on. But this brilliance at all of these kind of facial and realistic facial features, right? It almost as this, you don't have a photo. This was the best example of their likeness, while also highlighting all this kind of emotional aspects that were going on. But you also then have the skill of fabric textures, hairstyles, the elaborate dresses, and the gold inlay. And just, you can see all the different textures so elaborate in their clothing, in the tablecloth. And then you also have the nature background. All of these, right, if we put like, so facial features and emotion, nature background, fabric textures, right? These are all different skills, right? And to highlight, and then you could even argue, use of light and shadow, so that she's highlighting in this one painting so many different skills that are taking place, along with then the kind of close look at a competitive game that highlights both, the whole sitting in the garden or the backyard, right, is very domestic and connected to women in the household. But chess, right, is that game of intellect, which highlights their education and women as intelligent. So it's a very clever mix of all of those things. And then also just the various stages of the female face at different stages of life, from very young to older to much older with the maid. So a really kind of brilliant piece, and very popular, and probably the most well known. This one is also super impressive. This does not look like a self-portrait, but it is. And this is a Bernardino Campi painting, Sophonisba, but it's a self-portrait. But it doesn't look like a self-portrait. I always, like I said, I always struggle over her name. Hers is like the longest combination of names and stuff with that. I don't have enough Italian, and I always stumble over it. So I think this one's impressive because it's a self-portrait that does not look like a self-portrait. It looks like her teacher is well, it actually looks like someone else is painting them. And then it looks like she's not, so either she's painting, so either it looks like she's painting her teacher painting her, or someone else is painting her teacher painting her, right? It's almost like she's like secondary, but she's actually painting this. And so she's painting her teacher painting her, but also cleverly doing something that's meant to highlight, to show the viewer that she is the one doing this. It's meant to, in part, again, this use of this kind of very dark background, this very, it's meant to kind of set the mood, and also then it highlights the figures. But it's also interesting because he's wearing this black that almost fades him into the background, and she's wearing a very bright color, which and often if you look at her other self-portraits, look, she's usually wearing, we have this green background. When she has a lighter background, she's wearing darker, less colorful clothing. But in this portrait, she's wearing this bright red and white clothing that's very elaborate to show off her wealth. But part of it is you have this super dark background. And so her teacher, because of his clothing, is fading into the background while she pops and stands out. And that is intentional. So that use of color, the bit of that tenebrism, which highlights the use of a single light source with really dark background to set this mood, she cleverly uses to almost, like said, have her teacher fading into it while she stands out. If she had been wearing the normal dark clothing that many of her other self-portraits showed, she would have faded into the back too. But by choosing this, the light source is largely, is a little bit on him, but mostly the light source is on her, also causing her to pop and stand out over her teacher. And so this was meant to show her shift from student to independent artist. The other reason that this is doing that, besides what I just described, is she has an extra hand. So here's one arm, right? And her hand is back here behind him. And then if you follow her arm, her hand goes down here and goes up into here and almost melds with her teacher's hand. So she gave herself like a double hand arm. And why do this? Well, this idea was meant to show to the viewer that the hand is not his, but is hers. Right? Very clever. That merging of that, right, is to subtly show her role as the original painter, right? It's like, look, viewer, when you first take a look at this, you wouldn't think it's her painting. But if you're paying attention, she's telling you with this move of this double hand, right? Because if she was just sitting for it and he was painting her, none of this would be there. It would just be this arm like this, right? And you wouldn't have the other arm that goes up right here. But it's intentionally telling you why having her hand merged with his, because it's her hand that's painting it, not her teacher's. And thus showing that she's emerging from beyond him as a teacher into her own independent artist. I think it's one of the more clever ways of showcasing that, both not only the use of light and color, but then in the hand movement and structure as well. All right, and it certainly just demonstrated her superior skill as an artist too. In that, it also some argument that she was highlighting that she was a better painter than her teacher, but certainly was meant to highlight that that this was hers, and that, well, you might think initially that it was her teacher, but no, it's actually hers, and she's her own independent painter. This is the portrait of Catalina Miquela of Spain. I think this one's the modern portrait representation. This looks like this could be a more, not from the the time period is in, right, the like 1600 1500s and 1600s, but like this looks like this could be like 1920, period, maybe even the 40s. It's like it creates this very modern portrait of this was the Spanish princess. And you again have this background, and then the use of the white fur cape and a hair covering again makes it almost glow, so that it pops, that she stands out, right, almost shining as she looks at the viewer. The coat highlights her wealth and status, along with the necklaces that are just peeking out from underneath the fabric around her neck, right, which was meant to indicate, of course, her wealth and status. But also this confidence and leadership. Her gaze is meant to reflect her intelligence and her confidence as she, very confidently, looks at the viewer. This initially, when she married, her husband's courtiers did not initially like her due to her confidence and intelligence, but later she was praised for her ability to rule. And then the last one we're going to look at with her, before we have one other artist after this. And I know it's getting long. Always, I can't get away from that. The self-portrait at 78. So we have a portrait when she was older, and here you actually have the black clothing with the black background, and it's the chair that has the color that stands out more than her. And so you've got the self-portrait from which she started and the self-portrait that she ended her career, and it certainly has that bookend symbolism of that. So she's sitting on a red velvet chair, which contrasts the dark clothing, right? And in earlier self-portraits, she'd shown herself standing, painting with easels and brushes. She had one that I didn't show that was playing a musical instrument, holding the emblems of her family. And the other one, she's holding like a book. Here, she's sitting, which is somewhat, indicating her age. And she's holding a letter, and then it's hard to see, but she's holding a book, and she's got her finger like as a bookmark holding the spot in her book, as if she almost is just pausing for like a photo. It's very much her position is like she paused for the photo, right? Someone says, smile, and she sits there and puts her finger in to hold her place in the book she was reading, to pause for the photo, and then continues on with what she was doing. So it creates this kind of like that she was just briefly interrupted, that we caught her in the middle of something she was doing. Not that this, she spent a lot of time doing the painting, but that this was just a quick thing that took place. Right, and she's looking directly at the viewer here, and it's still giving her this as older but dignified, and intentionally meant to show not only status but intellect and knowledge in her older age. She certainly understood the power of the portrait to portray specific ideals, and continued to portray that even into her last portrait that she did. And the last artist we're going to look at is Lavinia Fontana. And she was the daughter of an artist, which is much more common when we look at women and artists. When they tend to be artists of this period is because they are daughters of artists, and so they get that training, since they still weren't allowed to be in the guild or in any kind of art school later when those developed. Her father was Prospero Fontana, who was one of the leading painters in Bologna at the time, and she was considered to be one of the first women to have a normal, successful artistic career, in the sense that she actually was like a professional artist who was paid. So where prior, like we talked about, she got gifts and stuff. Lavinia actually got paid for her work. And so that was seen as more of a traditional artist for that. And also unique, she also has the largest surviving body of work before 1700, which is huge. The fact of how much she had tons of commissions. She did a ton of religious paintings, as well as the typical Renaissance classical style religious paintings, and then of course some secular paintings as well, and portraits. Here's one of her. The self-portrait was one that she did, of course, to which is much more about highlighting her wealth and position. Um, this one is a self portrait that she did before. So this is a later. The first self portrait here that we looked at, this is a later self portrait. This is one of her earlier self portraits that she actually did as a gift to her future in laws. It was painted essentially as part of a dowry, demonstrating her artistic talents, in part because she came from, you know, a family that was, I don't know if they're super wealthy, but they had high status as well. The Zappi family, which she was married into, lacked financial resources, but had a super high social status. And so the marriage contract states that she actually gave them 2 self-portraits. But this one is interesting because it was very intentionally crafted to show like her value as a future wife. So right, it shows as playing a spinet, which was a type of standing kind of piano here, and then and this type of instrument was only played by upper class women, right? So that shows her status in that sense. And then she has a servant in the back, which highlights their wealth. Again, you had to be wealthy to have servants around you in this way. And so that informs that. In the very back, you also have painting easel, which signified that she was a painter and she could paint and make money. And then the inscription on the back wall states that she's the virgin daughter of Prospero, right? So to put that in writing in the back wall, virginity was important and required for marriage. And so all of this was like a interview or resume to her in-laws about the value that she would provide as a future daughter-in-law. The marriage contract actually was unusual because it stated that her new husband would actually come live with her father and his wife and with her, Lavinia. And that all of the couple's earnings would initially go to her parents. That's completely not how it normally worked. But I think they had a lot of leeway to be able to control the narrative because the Zappi family, while they had the high social status, had significant money problems. And so they didn't have the wealth to back up the normal transition of her moving in with her husband's family. And so they actually lived for quite a while with her family before eventually moving to Rome for artistic opportunities for her. She gave birth 11 times. Only 4 of the children lived into past adolescence. And she returned to painting quickly after each birth, which likely means that she was the breadwinner in the family, and it was the one that was making money for the family to remain in the status. But again, she's definitely like the first official professional artist in the sense that she was just directly paid. They didn't try to pretend with gifts. They just paid her for her work. She received a super important commission from a cardinal in 1599 and for a chapel, and it was to paint the Vision of Saint Hyacinth, and it was she was selected to illustrate an episode in the life of a newly canonized saint, and after that one, oops, let's go. So this is one of the earliest commissions that she had for portraying a saint for the church. And also she created a large altarpiece, and she ended up doing several after this. The Martyrdom of Saint Stephen for the cardinal after moving to Rome. And then she ended up creating multiple altarpieces after that. So she created several religious altarpieces for the churches, which again was unusual to have a female artist doing that. So again, we saw the example with the sculpt, with the relief, right? But that was a very small kind of piece. Her artwork was displayed. Displayed predominantly in areas and highlighted. I mean, they're very detailed and elaborate. But the fact that churches were hiring her to do this highlights her skill. So she moved to Rome to continue her work, and she was in great demand as a portraitist, as regular paintings, as secular paintings, and for the church to tell the end of her life when she died at the age of 62. One of the things that changed is when she went to Rome, her subject matter changed some. So here's one more for the church, an altarpiece. But after and here's an example of like with the portraits that she did of noble women, again with the little puppy and the super elaborate clothing. It meant to highlight, this is a traditional portrait that like a really wealthy family would commission her to do. And that would highlight, of course, the wife to show their wealth. And these were very standard. But these type of portraits made them a lot of money. And many noble families wanted these kind of portraits. So that's a kind of a typical example of a portrait. But again, just look at the level of detail, the face, the hair. It's so realistic and lifelike. The exquisite and detailed fabric is just, exquisite in her detail and the skill that she has to do this. And of course, that was highly valued in portraits to be that detailed. And then here you have Christ and the Samaritan at the well, which was a religious piece, but also a positive image of a woman having a prominent role in her artwork. And after going to Rome, her artwork shifted to include a lot more examples of powerful women or important women, like the Samaritan at the well. These are probably her two best known for powerful, strong women that she shifted to after moving to Rome. Judith with the head of Holofernes, and then the visit of the Queen of Sheba to the King Solomon. Queen Sheba, being able to manipulate and control Solomon and having that power over him. Judith, the story of Judith, and we're going to look at a couple actually other artists, female artists that did this with Judith, the paintings of Judith as well. It was a very popular one for women artists, in part because it was like Judith was a heroine and was a strong female character that these women could paint and highlight that strength and power. And especially in a world where there were very few women artists, to be able to highlight and portray strong female examples, characters, right? That sent a powerful message. And also, probably they were able to kind of envision themselves in that as well. The story of Judith is that she was a Jewish widow, and the Assyrian, here's the head of the Assyrian general. The Assyrians were invading her town. And so she goes with her maid. Judith is here. This is her maid. And this is definitely in that Tenebriism style here. And Lavinia did several ones. This is one. There was another one she did. And then we'll see next time too, several artists that did several others too. But Judith, sorry, lost my train of thought. Judith goes and like seduces the Assyrian general, gets him drunk, and then when he's like really drunk, she beheads him. She kills him. And then there's a lot of the scenes show her and her maid with the head like going back to show that he's been killed, so they don't have to worry anymore. And then when the Assyrians find their general dead, they flee and leave. Thus, she saves the town from the Assyrians. Right, so it's this idea of this super strong woman that's in charge and has power, and she shifted to this in her later work. So yeah, that's where we'll end it today, and we'll kind of actually pick up on this theme a little bit more next time as well.